Thank you so very much. It is indeed a great honor to follow His Excellency Zaki Nusseibeh on this August stage. And I just want to, on behalf of the Guggenheim, and I think many of us here who've spent the last 3 days together, to really thank the organizers of the Culture Summit this year. The whole team at DCT, for creating such an extraordinary time for us to convene in Abu Dhabi. If human history, urban history, and cultural history are aspects of time, then we all feel part of something truly historical happening here and now in the UAE. This panel, could I have the first slide? Thank you. This panel explores recent discourses of deep time, as we just heard, to consider these enormous shifts that have happened in art, technology, philosophy, and science, as well as we'll hear from Ella, new approaches to human well-being, to a new state of our own brains. I wish to thank Jitish Kalat for inspiring this panel. I visited his studio in Mumbai in February 2020, just before the world shut down, and our conversation then sent me into intellectual orbit. And our talks and visits ever since, including through the spell of COVID, really sustained me. So this panel brings together these extraordinary interdisciplinary artists, Jitish Kalat from Mumbai, and Himalaya Singh Soin from Delhi, and where else do you live?
London.
Sort of London, all over the world, the Himalayas. And our visionary anthropologist, Ella Saltmarsh of London, to pose the following questions. What does it mean to encounter deep $13.5 billion years of the universe, but in a very Western kind of arrow. Here is something that I think most of us in the room would feel more comfortable with, which is a spiral and a cycle. The presumed primacy of written textual evidence as the basis of history is eroding, all of us here believe, around posing new ways of thinking about the relationship, which all of you are working on, between human and non-human consciousness, natural and supernatural phenomena, which we're going to hear from Himali, the land and planetary time, which I think we're going to also hear about from Jitish. How can humanity benefit from shifting its order and conception of time? Astronomers, as we've just heard, now estimate the universe to be 13.7 billion years old. These discoveries, which are much deeper and older than astronomers and cosmologists had previously understood, have led to new thinking around time as a pluriverse of cosmological, geological, and anthropological temporalities. Yet another sense of geological finitude has dawned on us since the early 21st century, which affects all the work that we will be discussing today and touches on the work that all of you are exploring in your different media. The threats of climate crisis and humanity's short-term thinking on the long-term future of the planet have unleashed an imaginary and time warp that we could have never imagined before. Our own extinction. This is what Ella calls a time of emergency. Our goal is not to answer any of these questions, but to open up questions, considerations, and positions that can expand the way we conceive and maybe take some of Himali's beautiful poetic language to help us articulate time as inhabitants, collective inhabitants of the earth today. I just have one final slide to share with you, which is another kind of timeline to introduce into our thinking as art makers, which is in 2018, archaeologists discovered this hashtag drawing in ochre on a tiny flake of stone in the Blombos cave in South Africa. The Blombos cave hashtag, which you see to the right, really dates the articulation of human beings using a tool to represent abstract thought 35,000 years earlier than what we had previously understood, which was, of course, the cave drawings in Indonesia and others also across Australia. So it is now estimated that you are in a timeline of 73,000 years of human artistic symbolic thought. And I think that that also is a good entryway into our panel today. So Jitish, would you like to start us off? I think Jitish in this context needs no introduction. I think among all the many biennials that you have been part of, it's really the Kochi Biennial where you served as artistic director and curator from 2014 to 2015, which really established many of the ideas that we're thinking about today in the region. So let me hand this to you and over to you for your presentation. We're going to just ask each of you first, what does deep time mean to you, and what is the how do you probe it in your practice? And this is a way of self-introduction as well.
Thank you, Alexandra. I mean, I've valued every conversation we've had, so it's a pleasure to have extended dialogue with other friends and colleagues with shared interests. Thank you all for coming. You know, at one fundamental level, space and time become the very substrate through which all our lives are experienced. And yet, space, in a sense, feels like objects that are placed relative to each other. But when we observe those objects move or change, we construe time. So anytime we observe change, we experience time. And yet, on a day-to-day basis, our own experience of time remains sort of bound, perhaps, through evolution, hardwired to be constrained, to just filter out everything else except a narrow band of time. And yet, in our own contemplative life or in our own creative life, we feel the need, even to look at this clicker, I have to take it back and forth in space to see it more clearly, or think back and forth in time, all the time to sort of relocate myself in the present moment. So waking up this morning, the fact that Andromeda Galaxy is hurtling towards the Milky Way at a dazzlingly fast speed has no consequence on me actually having to localize and say, I'm in Abu Dhabi and I'm going to the Culture Summit. So in that sense, our narrow-banded time keeps us going until we enter a contemplative, reflective space within our studios or on our writing desks. And it's at that moment that I feel that extending this focal length beyond that focal length into deeper focal lengths of time allow for a greater reflection of the now. So unlike a geologist, who might look at fossil records or tectonic plates, or cosmologists, as our previous speaker was just talking about the great distances cosmologically, within the arts, often these questions bring us back to what does thinking about deep time or thinking from a deeper point in time change the way we think now. I think that probably is the space from where I would enter this conversation.
And Ella, where would you say, what is your position for exploring deep time in your practice?
Great. Well, firstly, a huge thank you to DCT for hosting me and this conversation. And before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge all the young in the world today, human and more than human, and all the lives that have yet to come. And I hope that our conversation here will be supportive and generative for them. So in my role as director of the Long Time Project, we think about time a lot. And we specifically think about time in the context of supporting individuals, institutions and societies to be better ancestors. And to do that, we work with deep time, so with geological time, with civilizational time, with human time, with ancestral time, with cosmological time, with many different times. And we do that because each of these temporalities enables us to build our good ancestor muscle in a different way. And I guess if we're thinking particularly about deep time, something that I am obsessed by at the moment in deep time is when you hang out in deep time, which I seem to spend quite a lot of my life doing at the moment, you start to realize how improbable life on Earth is. There are so many events in our deep history when things just totally should not have worked out in a way that enables complex life. Like we should not be. And the more I learn about this, the more it helps me develop a sense of awe and wonder at the world we have today. It is so improbable. And that awe and wonder really fires me up to protect it. So a big question that I have at the moment for all of us in this room is how can we create more experiences that enable more of us to experience how improbable our lives are, and therefore to inspire us to take more action to protect this incredible world of ours.
Wonderful. Himali, do you want to give us your practice in an essence of maybe 1 minute?
Yeah, I was going to also just say that's so interesting that you say that you think it's improbable, because I can't imagine how every virus, every atom, every blip of time cannot collide to make us so probable, right? It's impossible that we couldn't have existed. For me, obviously, maybe the last century would have depicted deep time as cosmological and geological, but it's impossible not to recognize how we, this tiny species of humans, have entered this longue durée of infinite time, created plastics that may never disappear, processed nuclear waste that will far outlast us, war that is going to be in our skins and in our multi-species ancestors forever. How have we been able to make such a large mark on deep time? And so I suppose, how do you probe it? For me, it's poetry, because poetry, literally, metaphor means to carry across. My mind is like a river. That is, I have already combined the idea of the mind with the river. I have brought two different temporalities, two different objects in space, and merged them. So poetry allows us to jump time in those ways, and music too, in a way. We create this thing that then transcends us and might outlive us.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you very much. I think you understand now each of the positions of each of our speakers, and we're going to go into presentation. So Jitish, if you'd like to go first and share, I think, 2 of your projects.
That's right.
In about 6 minutes.
Yes, we'll try and keep time. Does this move forward at all? Yes. So basically, I will share 2 works of mine. One is a piece called Covering Letter Terrendum Nuncius. And essentially, when you walk into the space I'll literally describe the work, literally table both works, and then we can get into other things as we speak. Is a round table of 116 images. All of these images were composed by Frank Drake and Carl Sagan, to be placed on the golden records atop the Voyager 1 and 2 space missions, the only objects made by us humankind that have now exited the domain of the solar system and are now drifting away from us at 17 kilometers per second, and are likely to go on well beyond, of course, our extinction for sure, but beyond the extinction of the planet, perhaps the death of our star, etc. In the vastness of empty space, it would go on until found by a sentient extraterrestrial species. So within the work, 55 salutations of to the universe percolate the space, and I'll play a short video. Oh my God, did I go? Can we just play the video?
Hai công tình yêu,您好，您吃饱未？有闲就来阮家坐。
تحياتنا للأصدقاء في النجوم يا ليت يجمعنا الزمان.
Shalom.
Բոլոր անոնց, որ գտնվին դիեզերքի միքամազություններեն անտին, ողջույններ.
Namaskar. Bishe Shanti.
買辣嘢。各位好嘛？祝各位平安、健康、快樂。
Milí přátelé, přejeme vám vše nejlepší.
Hartelijke groeten aan iedereen.
Hello from the children of planet Earth.
Bonjour tout le monde.
So in the work, it's a summary of life on Earth, which includes the form of a reptile, an image of a conch shell, traffic jams in Dhaka, United Nations building, a small dwelling, dimensions of our celestial bodies, human anatomy, childbirth.
Music
the fact
too,
that,
right?
Sorry?
Music also.
Music, and the fact that we've ever lived, we've tasted, we've drunk, and we've eaten. It's to me at the core of this work was this desire to speak to the other, that's so unknown and afar in space, time, and in every constitution. That would we ever know if this sentient interstellar life would know if it is this species that's sentient or the reptile. And in this scenario, the core of the work really came from the acute disappearance of shared vocabulary across divisions. We were speaking about future elections in multiple countries, and it almost feels like that vocabulary is lost. And so in such a scenario, what does it mean to reflect on an archive that essentially speaks to the other in every possible difference, both space and time, away from us? And I mean, in the work itself, the images themselves are not exactly what were uploaded. In 1977, there wasn't that kind of computing capacity to put these images on a disk. So the images were crypted as a sound file with a code for the species traveling interstellar to find us by decoding the code. So the images that you just saw in the work were all decoded by a California-based programmer named Ron Barry, bringing back us from those sounds in the same way that a future species might find us. But also, like any message that's sent, this message also went with a return address. So this diagram that you see are essentially a diagram of our own cosmic neighborhood. 14 pulsars were earmarked as a way to kind of have standard candles, flickering stars, to invite the alien back to us. But we know since 1977 that there are not 14 pulsars, but several 100,000 pulsars. And also points to our own lack of certitude of our place in the universe. Equally sitting alongside this image is a seating device. The benches in the work essentially come from a form that was almost presented by the atomic of the first producers of the atomic bomb, as an announcement of our own collective possibility of extinction. It started as 7 minutes to midnight more than 50 years ago. In the year that I made the work, it was 2 minutes to midnight. As we speak, it's reaching a little over a minute a midnight, as our own existential risks keep adding on. So this was a work which had 4 elements that became a letter, with the earth being a kind of letterbox that from where this letter leaves. But I'll almost quickly move on to another body of work, which is a suite of drawings I made between early 2021, 1st of Jan 2021, until the end of the year. So it's a portfolio of 365 drawings. Each drawing has a moment in time, which is the hour of the minute of that day, the moment when I make the drawing, and carries 3 other integers alongside a form. The 3 integers being all the numbers of us that exist on the planet at that moment in time, the numbers of us that have passed up to that moment becoming a negative integer, and the numbers of us that were born forming another positive integer that collectively add up to the number the next day. And when I made my first drawing, of course, I hadn't thought I'd make another one. Like everything you do in the studio, that's, many things don't go further. But this became the one thing that I did that year that produced a corpus of intuitions for the entire day. Every 4 days, we would have 1 million more people. Every couple of weeks, we had all of Australia being added on. Another couple of weeks, all of Canada gets on. And it goes on and on until the that both of you pointed out, of the fact that all of this seems to be at the expense of our last moment arrival on the planet to reorganize everything that we saw in the first diagram that Alexander shared, that we're just kind of resetting the planet. And this swelling number is essentially at the expense of every disappearing species. I mean, incidentally, I learned later that this year, 2021 was a year that had maximum number of extinctions. I'll just run through till the end of the slides and.
So it has sort of geographical, it encompasses geography in a sense, planetary geography, as well as the human integer of
I mean, in a way,
population.
We have words like humanity, and we often don't know how to even work through that abstraction of that term. I mean, numbers are actually beautiful and powerful abstractions. They carry so many codes, even as you write them. Sometimes I would write a long number and end up with the number 4, becoming acutely aware there are 4 members in my family that I'm writing at the end of a long integer. And I subtract another integer, the ledger goes on, and the next day it carries forward and carries forward. So it became a kind of, in the studio you need rituals, to actually be able to even harness intuitions that become nebulous and disappear even before you can capture them. So these drawings kind of allowed me to stay in a space of inquiry with 3 numbers anchoring every drawing. They've been exhibited like this as a horizon of drawings. And also as immersive mural wallpaper-like environments.
They need to be accumulative, as I saw in the studio.
Yes, and then they kind of, become almost like hieroglyphics that speak back to intuitions that I could barely compute if I didn't have these numbers to kind of think through in some ways.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So Ella, over to you.
Great, thank you. Okay.
Tell us how you're saving the world.
Well, I will talk a bit about our work. So this is going to be fairly prosaic. I thought I would give an insight into the nuts and bolts of how we are trying to shift culture at scale. So I'm hoping that our conversation afterwards will be slightly more poetic. So as I said up top, our work is all about how do we support everybody to be better ancestors, as individuals and collectively. And to do that, we are really seeking to support an ontological shift across our societies. We are seeking deep and wide-scale change. And one of the important distinctions that we made when we began this work was we created a new word. We created long-timism to distinguish what we were doing from the field of long-termism. So long-termism is quite an established field. It is generally about predicting, planning, preparing for the future. There is definitely an element of that in the work that we do, but we are also really concerned with how do you cultivate care for the world that is to come. And that is about the work of emotions. That requires other skills, other methods, other practices than the traditional field of long-termism. And so why are we doing this work? Jitesh, I was smiling as you were talking because I was like, this slide is already really out of date. With the figures, we've got 7.7 billion, and I, need to update it. So I use this slide to kind of talk about why we're doing this work. It is a slide that is produced by my longtime colleague, Roman Krasnarek. And in it, we see in the green dot, all of us alive right now, a bit more than 7.7 billion of us. We see all of the humans who have lived over the past 50,000 years. 100 billion of us. And then we see all the potential lives that could be lived over the next 50,000 years, or 6.75 trillion. And that's just human lives. Imagine how enormous that circle would be if it was all life on Earth. And the reason that I show this is because that is what we are holding in our hands right now. Those of us alive at this moment have a disproportionate amount of responsibility for the fate of future generations. It is on us and what we do in the next decade as to the quality of those lives and ultimately whether they exist at all. So that's why this question of what it means to be a good ancestor and how do we shift our societies at speed and scale to reorientate themselves around care and stewardship is so important. My background is partly as a systems nerd. I don't have time, luckily for you, to go into systems theory now. If anyone wants to come and nerd out with me afterwards, come and find me. But I just want to highlight that there are different models that we use to shift systems and to understand how to shift systems and the role of culture in shifting systems. And so, for example, this model is from Donella Meadows, the kind of grandmother of systems change. And it is her model of leverage points to intervene in a system. And the main thing to kind of look at is what is at the far right of the image. And the leverage power increases as you move up towards the right. And the most powerful things you can do to shift systems are to shift mindsets and paradigms. And that is the work of culture. And that is why culture is foundational. It is literally the soil from which our economics, our politics, our law grow. It is so important, and that's why we are working with culture to do this. So I thought I'd talk about a few of the different avenues that we are doing this work to give you insight into the tangible, because it can all feel very abstract. So we have a strand of work that is working with government. This is a project called the Long Time Tools. We worked with policymakers from local, regional and national governments globally to design a set of tools that they can take back into their institutions to enable them to be more long-term. And these are tools, some of the tools are about the culture of an organization, some of them about the operations of an organization. There's lots more to say about that political work, but no time. So again, come and talk to me if you want to find out more. We also work to try and influence the culture of ideas. So this is a partnership we had with the Serpentine and the RSA in the UK back in 2020 that was really about how do we start to have long-timism as an idea that is hanging around in the intellectual ether. And how do we support the field of practitioners in this space? We also did that directly through getting work out in the media, whether writing articles for the BBC, this is a film we did with the BBC for BBC Ideas, and then directly partnering with cultural institutions. So this was a project we advised Kew Gardens on last year. Because we advised them on it, there is a time travelling section. This is me being a bit of a dork with my contribution to that exhibition. But we also create work directly to reach the public. So this is from our podcast, which we create with Headspace, the meditation app. And with the podcast, we have these very rich episodes, but then these are accompanied by practices, these bonus episodes, which enable you to feel the ideas you hear about. And we feel that practice and emotion is so important for this work. The podcast surprised us all and did very well. So we won the kind of Oscars of UK podcasting, the Radio Academy Award for Best Indie, along with a load of other awards. And I guess we were so excited about this because our aim had been, how do we influence popular culture? How do we work with popular culture to shift popular culture? And part of our theory of change with the podcast has been that we are equipping listeners to be champions for these ideas. So we create a suite of tools that they can use. Some are very simple, like these long time cards, but then there are more involved workshops that they can run within their organizations. And I think the success of the podcast has meant that these ideas really are now much more present in popular culture. And I want to leave with this quote from one of our collaborators, a geologist, Professor Marsha Bjornerud. Because as I said at the start, we haven't really had time to talk about the content of this work. So I wanted to kind of use my time to talk about the why and the how, but not the what. And I think the what, for me, the what is really interesting. So as I say, I'm really excited to dive into that shortly.
Thank you and congratulations. It's totally extraordinary. I am downloading that podcast today. Himali, if you could take us into the Ice Age.
Actually, the last 5 years or so, after I went to the North and South Pole, particularly in Svalbard and in the Antarctic Peninsula, where there's no human inhabitants. So I would ask my guides and my fellow travelers, where are the myths and the legends of these places? And everyone said, there are no myths here because no one lives here. And I realized that there was a kind of elder that had so much language and so many stories, and that was the ice itself. Yeah. And the ice, like indigenous people across the North and South Pole, it was losing its language. So for all those years, I spent just telling stories from the perspective of ice. And during the pandemic, I found myself locked down in the Himalayas. And it felt like it had arrived to me as my third pole. I called it my third pole. And I came upon this amazing story of the CIA in collaboration with the Indian Intelligence Bureau. They planted a nuclear-powered spy device on top of one of our most sacred mountains, the patron goddess Nanda Devi. The way I tell the story is that they went up there to plant this spy device into the mountain, and it was a phallic device, and the mountain, being a goddess, resisted this and rustled up a storm. So that day there was a terrible storm, and the men had to just leave the device and come back down. They said, we'll install it in the next season. The device is still missing.
Yeah.
And it's very possible that its plutonium has not only leaked into the mountain, but into the Ganges river that the mountain feeds. So this led me to start kind of thinking about the life of what this spy device might have seen. But then there's a kind of personal narrative that enters, because my father is a mountaineer, and he went to this mountain 10 years later, 10 years after this incident in 78, and took a photograph of the mountain. This photograph became a stamp by the Indian Telegraph Service. So I had a kind of formal conceit. The spy device was going to begin to write letters to the mountain and tell it what it has seen. So we'll see the first 3 minutes of that video.
Dear mountain, how does one move you, shift you, but also elicit emotion? Make you cry because something was too beautiful or it hurt? A mountain has been moved before by monkey gods in search of healing herbs. Herbs that made themselves invisible because medicine is a medium, a pathway, a pill, a spillage, an image, age. So the monkey god avulsed the whole mountain with his hands and flew it across the ocean. Sound waves traveled from those quieted at a distance. But there were stars, and the mountain found itself moved. From my vantage point, I am divine or sublime. I'm a different God, a radiant God, irradiant, iridescent, you err, an error encrypting me. The mountain embracing the God, a glitch in the story. At first, I fidget around the rocky parts of you that poke my metal sides, the crevices that jab my antenna, but we eventually make kin with one another, an other. My atomic lightness balanced with your tectonic stability enables us to stay floating in space. You are the omniscient narrator, the second and third person, the base and the peak. Peek into the future and I will be omnipresent too, thrumming in the very veins of the world, in the venomous veins of this verse.
So beautiful. So beautiful.
So that was an imagination of the mountain, the stamp, as if it were exposed to radiation. And the music you hear was made on Nagara drums that we created with an artisan in the Himalayas. And the sound are the Sufi rhythms of the Uyghur community that the device would have overlooked and are, of course, going through their own genocide currently. And we imagine that the radio device was not only picking up nuclear missile testing as it was meant to, but it was also picking up underground protest songs. So this was a way to tell these stories of also the communities around. And then, of course, like you said, the letter must receive a response. The second part of the series of Static Range is where the mountain responds to the atom. And that takes place in Sellafield in the UK. And it kind of bridges the colony and the empire. And it starts to speak between these two zones of inclusion and exclusion. And then finally, there's other parts of this series, but we grow a bioremedic garden everywhere that Static Range travels, a garden made up of plants that absorbs radiation. So just thinking about, on one hand, the mutation and the depletion caused by nuclear power, energy, and fuel, and the indigenous lives at stake in the extraction of these fuels, but on the other hand, trying to create a garden for the future so that we have a sense of healing or a kind of fissure for renewal to take place.
Thank you so much, Himali. That's so beautiful. And I think what I'm struck by with all three of your practices from very different positions, different media, again, different time zones that you're looking at, including not deep time, but deep future, is kind of an activism of care and an activism of cultural care, or the possibility, or really the urgency, the mandate of culture at this time in the 21st century to incorporate care for people, for the unborn, for Nanda Devi. So I think that's a very powerful message for each of us to go forward with. And I just commend the practices and the artistry and the deep research and the deep care that each of you is bringing. Is there a question any of you has for each other before I'm going to ask Himali to do a little bit of a reading for us in the last minute or so?
While Ella was speaking, especially of systems, I had this sort of bewildering recall of, I think it's Ron Milo's work, which talks about the 2020 being the year when the entire anthropomass on this planet exceeds beyond the biomass, which means everything that we humans have produced today exceed every other life form's weight in terms of molecule to molecule grammage on this planet. And it's also more phones than bones, as he says. So I think when I was sort of looking at these staggering numbers of future systems, suddenly that sort of thought came to mind, Yeah.
More phones than bones.
Yeah, the more phone subscribers than human beings on the planet.
Yeah.
And certainly more instruments than human beings. So it's really exciting.
And if you get involve animals in that, the number becomes, again, enormous and colossal. I always think when I read about a wildfire, I think about the animals. I think about the tigers whose feet are burned, and the birds who die in flight. This is my grief. Himali, do you want to end with a few sentences from Salvation Futurism, since we're ending on a futurist note?
Okay.
Thank you.
This is from a South Asian Futurism manifesto called Subcontinentment. And it comes out of realizing that the North and South Pole weren't these distant elsewheres, but these entangled heres. And I found all these kind of connections between South Asia and the poles. And it asks whether we too in the global South could afford a sense of rest. South Asian futurism does not fantasize about a future because it cannot isolate the future from the past. It fantasizes about a life in between. It wishes to grab language by its horns, grab the English language by its horns, and wring it off its yeses and nos and everythings and nothings, and hang it out to dry in the equatorial sun in the middle of infinity. Its locus is entangled. material and spiritual, subliminal and subversive and submissive at once. Bipolar. South Asian futurism is a witness to the ash warmth of the morning when the newspapers have smacked the ironclad gates and a few are lost in trees or transit. South Asian futurism dismisses its title, denouncing South Asia as a universal region without specificity, denouncing futurism as an accomplice to the violence that comes with acceleration. South Asian futurism would like to call itself subcontinentment, a skewed portmanteau of subcontinent and contentment. An idealistic futurism that is scientific but does not believe in science as a solution. Its science fiction does not project a dystopia despite the carbon. It wants an alchemy of knowledges. It wants rumors, humors, hypotheses. It wants ancient imaginaries and everyday erasures. It wants to rest.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Ancestors, one and all, I think we are invited to adjourn.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.